Chapter 25 of the Chestermarke Instinct. This recording is in the public domain. Recording by MaryAnn. The Chestermarke Instinct by J.S. Fletcher. Chapter 25. The Portrait. The offices of Mr. Godwin Markham, at which the two detectives presented themselves soon after 10:30 next morning, were by no means extensive in size or palatial in appearance. They were situated on the second floor of a building in Conduit Street, and apparently consisted of no more than 2 rooms, which, if not exactly shabby, were somewhat well worn as to furniture and fittings. It was evident, too, that Mr. Godwin Markham's clerical staff was not extensive. There was a young man clerk and a young woman clerk in the outer office. The first was turning over a pile of circulars at the counter. The second, seated at a typewriter, was taking down a letter which was being dictated to her by a man who, still hatted and overcoated, had evidently just arrived, and was leaning against the mantelpiece with his hands in his pockets. He was a very ordinary, plain-countenanced, sandy-haired, quite commercial-looking man, this, who might have been anything from a stock-exchange clerk to a suburban house-agent. But there was a sudden alertness in his eye as he turned it on the visitors, which showed them that he was well equipped in mental acuteness, and probably as alert as his features were commonplace. The circular-sorting young man looked up with indifference as Easleby approached the counter, and when the detective asked if Mr. Godwin Markham could be seen, turned silently and interrogatively to the man who leaned against the mantelpiece. He, interrupting his dictation, came forward again, narrowly but continually eyeing the 2 men. "Mr. Markham is not in town, gentlemen," he said, in a quick, business-like fashion, which convinced Starmidge that the speaker was not uttering any mere excuse. "He was here yesterday for an hour or 2, but he will be away for some days now. Can I do anything for you? His manager." Easleby handed over the 2 professional cards which he had in readiness, and leaned across the counter. "A word or two in private," he whispered confidentially. "Business matter." Starmidge, watching Mr. James Stipp's face closely as he looked at the cards, saw that he was not the sort of man to be taken unawares. There was not the faintest flicker of an eyelid, not a motion of the lips, not the tiniest start of surprise, no show of unusual interest on the manager's part. He nodded, opened a door in the counter, and waved the 2 detectives towards the inner room. "Be seated, gentlemen," he said, following them inside. "You'll excuse me a minute important letter to get off. I won't keep you long." He closed the door upon them, and Starmidge and Easleby glanced round before taking the chairs to which Mr. Stipp had pointed. There was little to see. A big, roomy desk, Middle Victorian in style, some heavy Middle Victorian chairs, a well-worn carpet and rug, a bookcase filled with peerages, baronetages, county directories, army lists, navy lists, and other similar volumes of reference to high life, a map or 2 on the walls, a heavy safe in a corner. These things were all there was to look at, except one thing, which Starmidge was quick to see. Over the mantelpiece, with an almanac on one side of it and an interest table on the other, hung a somewhat faded photograph of Gabriel Chestermarke. The younger detective tapped his companion's arm and silently indicated this grim counterfeit of the man in whose doings they were so keenly interested just then. "That's the man," he whispered. "Chestermarke. Gabriel." Easleby opened mouth and eyes and stared with eager interest. "Egad!" he muttered. "That's lucky. Makes it all the easier. I'll lay you anything you like, my lad, this manager doesn't know anything not a thing about the double identity business. We shall soon find out. Leave it to me, at first, anyway. A few plain questions." Mr. Stipp came bustling in, closing the door behind him. He took off overcoat and hat, ran his fingers through his light hair, and, seating himself, glanced smilingly at his visitors. "Well, gentlemen," he demanded, "what can I do for you now? Want to make some inquiries?" "Just a few small inquiries, sir," replied Easleby. "I haven't the pleasure of knowing your name. Mr. " "Stipp's my name, sir," answered the manager promptly. "Stipp James Stipp." "Thank you, sir," said Easleby, with great politeness. "Well, Mr. Stipp, you see from our cards who we are. We've called on you, as representing Mr. Godwin Markham, on behalf informally, Mr. Stipp of Mrs. Lester of Lowdale Court, Chesham." Mr. Stipp's face showed a little surprise at this announcement, and he glanced from one man to the other as if he were puzzled. "Oh!" he said. "Dear me! Why, what has Mrs. Lester called you in for?" Easleby, who had brought another marked newspaper with him, laid it on the manager's desk. "You've no doubt read of this Scarnham affair, Mr. Stipp?" he asked, pointing to his own blue pencillings. "Most people have, I think. Or perhaps it escaped your notice." "Hardly could," answered Mr. Stipp, with a friendly smile. "Yes, I've read it. Most extraordinary. One of the most puzzling cases I ever did read. Are you in at it? But this call hasn't anything to do with that, surely? If it has, what?" "This much," answered Easleby. "Mrs. Lester has told us, of course, that her son, the young officer, is in debt to your governor. Well, last week, Mrs. Lester handed a certain sum of money to the Mr. Frederick Hollis who's been found dead at Scarnham, to be applied to the settlement of her son's liability in that respect." Mr. Stipp showed undoubted surprise at this announcement. "She did!" he exclaimed. "Gave Mr. Hollis money for that? Why? Mr. Hollis never told me of it." In the course of a long professional experience, Easleby had learned to control his facial expression. Starmidge was gradually progressing towards perfection in that art, but each man was hard put to it to check an expression of astonishment, and Easleby showed some slight sign of perplexity when he replied. "Mr. Hollis has called on you, then?" he said. "Hollis was here last Friday afternoon," answered Mr. Stipp. "Called on me at 5 o'clock, just before I was leaving for the day. He never offered me any money. Glad if he had. It's time young Lester paid up." "What did Hollis come for, then, if that's a fair question?" asked Easleby. "He came, I should say, to take a look at us, and find out who he'd got to deal with," replied the manager, smiling. "In plain language, to make an inquiry or two. He told me he'd been empowered by Mrs. Lester to deal with us, and he wanted the particulars of what we'd advanced to her son, and he got them, from me. But he never made me any offer. He just found out what he wanted to know, and went away." "And, evidently, next day travelled to Scarnham," observed Easleby. "Now, Mr. Stipp, have you any idea whether his visit to Scarnham was in connection with the money affair of yours and young Lester's?" Again the look of undoubted surprise. Again the appearance of genuine perplexity. "I?" exclaimed Mr. Stipp. "Not the least. Not the ghost of an idea. What could his visit to Scarnham have to do with us? Nothing that I know of, anyway." "You don't think it rather remarkable that Mr. Hollis should go down there the very day after he called on you?" asked Starmidge, putting in a question for the first time. "Why should I?" asked Mr. Stipp. "What do I know about him and his arrangements? He never mentioned Scarnham to me." Easleby laid a finger on the marked newspaper. "You see some names of Scarnham people there, Mr. Stipp," he observed. "Those names Horbury, Chestermarke. You don't happen to know 'em?" "I don't know 'em," replied the manager, with obvious sincerity. "Banking people, all of them, aren't they? I might have heard their names, in a business way, some time, but I don't recall them at all." "You said that Mr. Markham was here yesterday," suggested Starmidge. "Did you tell him you'll excuse my asking, but it's important did you tell him that Hollis had called last Friday on behalf of Mrs. Lester?" "I just mentioned it," replied Mr. Stipp. "He took no particular notice, except to say that what we claim from young Lester will have to be paid." "You don't know if he knew Hollis?" inquired Starmidge. The manager shook his head in a fashion which seemed to indicate that Hollis's case was no particular business of either his or his principal's. "I don't think he did," he answered. "Never said so, anyhow. But, I say, you'll excuse me, now, what is it you're trying to get at? Do you think Hollis went to Scarnham on this business of young Lester's? And if you do, why?" Easleby rose, and Starmidge followed his example. "We don't know yet, exactly, why Hollis went to Scarnham," said the elder detective. "We hoped you could help us, but as you can't, well, we're much obliged, Mr. Stipp. That your governor over the chimney-piece there?" "Taken a few years ago," replied Mr. Stipp carelessly. "I say, you don't know what Hollis was empowered to offer us, do you?" The two detectives looked at each other, a quiet nod from Starmidge indicating that he left it to Easleby to answer this question. After a moment's reflection, Easleby spoke. "Mr. Hollis was empowered to offer £10,000 in full satisfaction, Mr. Stipp," he said. "And what's more, A cheque for that amount was found on his dead body when it was discovered. Now, sir, you'll understand why we want to know who it was that he went to see at Scarnham." Both men were watching the money-lender's manager with redoubled attention. But it needed no very keen eye to see that the surprise which Mr. Stepp had already shown at various stages of the interview was nothing to that which he now felt, and in the midst of his astonishment the two detectives bade him good day and left him, disregarding an entreaty to stop and tell him more. "My lad," said Easleby, when he and Starmidge were out in the street again, "that chap has no more conception that his master is Gabriel Chestermarke than we had, 24 hours since, that Gabriel Chestermarke and Godwin Markham are one and the same man. He's a clever chap, this Gabriel, and now you see how important it's been for him to keep his secret. What's next to be done? We ought to keep in touch with him from now." "I'm expecting word from Gandam at noon at headquarters," answered Starmidge, who had already told Easleby of the visit of the previous night. "Let's ride down there and hear if any message has come in." But as their taxi cab turned out of Whitehall into New Scotland Yard, they overtook Gandam, hurrying along. Starmidge stopped the cab and jumped out. "Any news?" he asked sharply. "He's off, Mr. Starmidge," replied Gandam. "I've just come straight from watching him away. He left his house about 9:20, walked to the St. John's Wood station, went down to Baker Street and on to King's Cross Metropolitan. We followed him, of course. He walked across to St. Pancras and left by the 10:30 express." "Did you manage to find out where he booked for?" demanded Starmidge. "Ecclesborough," answered Gandam. "Heard him. I was close behind." "He was alone, I suppose?" asked Starmidge. "Alone all the time, Mr. Starmidge," assented Gandam. "Never saw a sign of the other party." Starmidge rejoined Easleby. For the last 24 hours he had let his companion supervise matters, but now, having decided on a certain policy, he took affairs into his own hands. "Now then," he said, "he's off, back to Scarnham. A word or two at the office, Easleby, and I'm after him. And you'll come with me." Chapter 26 of the Chestermarke Instinct. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by MaryAnn. The Chestermarke Instinct by J.S. Fletcher. Chapter 26 The Lightning Flash. At 7:30 that evening, Starmidge and Easleby stepped out of a London express at Ecclesborough and walked out to the front of the station to get a taxi-cab for Scarnham. The newsboys were rushing across the station square with the latest editions of the evening papers, and Starmidge's quick ear caught the meaning of the unfamiliar North Country shoutings. "Latest about the Scarnham mystery," he said, stopping a lad and taking a couple of papers from him. "Something about the adjourned inquest. Of course, that would be today. Now then, what's this?" He drew aside to a quiet corner of the station portico, and with his companion looking over his shoulder, read aloud a passage from the latest of the two papers. "An important witness gave evidence this afternoon at the adjourned inquest held at Scarnham on the body of Mr. Frederick Hollis, solicitor, of London, who was recently found lying dead at the bottom of one of the old lead mines in Ellersdeane Hollow. It will be remembered that the circumstance of this discovery, already familiar to our readers, allied with the mysterious disappearance of Mr. John Hornbury, and the presumed theft of the Countess of Ellersdeane's jewels, seem to indicate an extraordinary crime, and opinion varies considerably in the Scarnham district as to whether Mr. Hollis, the reason of whose visit to Scarnham is still unexplained, fell into the old mine by accident, or whether he was thrown in. At the beginning of the proceedings this afternoon, a shepherd named James Livesey of Ellersdeane, employed by Mr. Marchant, farmer, of the same place, was immediately called. He stated in answer to questions put by the coroner that, on Monday morning last, he had gone with his employer to an out-of-the-way part of Northumberland to buy new stock, and in consequence of his absence from home had not heard of the Scarnham affair until his return this morning, when, on Mr. Marchant's advice, he had at once called on the coroner's office to volunteer information. Livesey's evidence in brief was as follows. At 9 o'clock last Saturday evening he was walking home from Scarnham to Ellersdeane by a track which crosses the Hollow and cuts into the high road between the town and the village at a point near the Warren, an isolated house which is the private residence of Mr. Gabriel Chestermarke, banker, of Scarnham. As he reached this point, he saw Mr. John Horbury, whom he knew very well by sight, accompanied by a stranger, come out of the Hollow by another path, cross the high road, and walk down the lane which leads to the Warren. They were talking very earnestly, but Mr. Horbury saw him and said good night in answer to his own greeting. There was a strong moonlight at the time, and he saw the stranger's face clearly. He was quite sure that the stranger was the dead man whose body had just been shown to him at the mortuary. Questioned further, Livesey positively adhered to all his statements. He was certain of the time, certain of the identity of the two gentlemen. He knew Mr. Horbury very well indeed, and had known him for many years. Mr. Horbury had often talked to him when they met in the fields and lanes of the neighbourhood. He had no doubt at all that the dead man he had seen in the mortuary was the gentleman who was with Mr. Horbury on Saturday night. He had noticed him particularly as the two gentlemen passed him, and had wondered who he was. The moon was very bright that night. He saw Mr. Hollis quite plainly. He would have known him again at any time. He was positive that the two gentlemen entered the lane which led to Mr. Gabriel Chestermarke's house. They were evidently making a direct line for it when he first saw them, and they crossed the high road straight to its entrance. The lane led nowhere else than to the Warren. It was locally called the lane, but it was really a sort of carriage drive to Mr. Chestermarke's front door, and there was a gate at the high road entrance to it. He saw Mr. Horbury and his companion enter that gate. He heard it clash behind them. Questioned by Mr. Polke, Superintendent of Police at Scarnham, Livesey said that when he first saw the two gentlemen they were coming from the direction of Ellersdeane Tower. There was a path right across the Hollow, from a point in front of the Warren, to the Tower, and thence to the woods on the Scarnham side. That was the path the two gentlemen were on. He was absolutely certain about the time for two reasons. Just before he saw Mr. Horbury and his companion, he heard the clock at Scarnham Parish Church strike 9, and after they had passed him, he had gone on to the Green Archer public house, and had noticed that it was 10 minutes past 9 when he entered. Further questioned, he said he saw no one else on the Hollow but the two gentlemen. At the conclusion of Livesey's evidence, the coroner announced to the jury that, having had the gist of the witness's testimony communicated to him earlier in the day, he had sent his officer to request Mr. Gabriel Chestermarke's attendance. The officer, however, had returned to say that Mr. Chestermarke was away on business, and that it was not known when he would be back at the bank. As it was highly important that the jury should know at once if Mr. Horbury and Mr. Hollis called at the Warren on Saturday evening last, he, the coroner, had sent for Mr. Chestermarke's butler, who would doubtless be able to give information on that point. They would adjourn for an hour until the witness attended. "That's the end of it, in that paper," remarked Starmidge. "Let's see if the other has any later news. Ah, here we are. There is more in the stop the press space of this one. Now then." He held the second newspaper half in front of him, half in front of Ellersby, and again rapidly read over the report. Scarnham. Further adjournment. On the coroner's inquiry being resumed at 4 o'clock, Thomas Beavers, butler to Mr. Chestermarke at the Warren, said that so far as he knew, Mr. Horbury did not call on his master on Saturday evening last, nor did any gentleman call who answered the description of Mr. Hollis. It was impossible for anybody to call at the Warren in the ordinary way without his, the butler's, knowledge. As a matter of fact, the witness continued, Mr. Chestermarke was not at home during the greater part of that evening. Mr. Joseph Chestermarke had dined at the Warren at 7 o'clock, and at 8:30 he and his uncle left the house together. Mr. Chestermarke did not return until 11. Asked by Mr. Polke, Superintendent of the Police, if he knew in which direction Mr. Gabriel and Mr. Joseph Chestermarke proceeded when they went away, the witness said that a short time after they left the house, he, in drawing the curtains of the dining room, saw them walking on a side path of the garden, apparently in close conversation. He saw neither of them until Mr. Gabriel Chestermarke returned home alone at the time he had mentioned. Later. The inquest was further adjourned at the close of this afternoon's proceedings. Before adjourning, the coroner informed the jury that he understood there were rumours in the town to the effect that Mr. Hollis had been strangled before being thrown into the old lead mine. He need hardly say that there was not the slightest grounds for those rumours. But the medical men had some suspicion that the unfortunate gentleman might have been poisoned, and he, the coroner, thought it well to tell them that a specialist was being sent down by the Home Office, who, with the Scarnham doctors, would perform an autopsy on his arrival. The result would be placed before the jury when these proceedings were resumed. Starmidge dropped the paper and looked at Easleby with an expression of astonishment. "Poison!" he exclaimed. "That's a new idea. Poisoned first, and thrown into that old mine after? But there, what's the good of theorizing? Pick out the best of those cars. Let's get to Scarnham as quickly as possible. Something's got to be done tonight." Easleby made no immediate answer, but presently, when they were in a fast motor and leaving the Ecclesborough streets behind them, he shook his head and spoke more gravely than was usual with him. "The big question, my lad," he said, "is what to do? And there's another what's been done, and possibly what's being done. It's my impression something's being done now, still going on." "I know one thing," exclaimed Starmidge determinedly. "We'll confront Gabriel Chestermarke tonight with what we know. That's positive." "If we can find him," said Easleby. "You don't know. The coming down to Ecclesborough may have been all a blind. You can reach a lot of places from Ecclesborough, and you can leave a train at more than one place between Ecclesborough and London." "I telephoned Polke to keep an eye on him anyway, if he did arrive at either Scarnham or the Warren," answered Starmidge, still grimly determined. "And it's my impression that he has come down to see that nephew of his. Easleby, they're both in at it. Both." Again the elder detective made no answer. He was obviously much impressed by the recent developments as related in the newspapers which they had just read, and was deep in thought about them and the possibilities which they suggested to him. "Well," he said at last, as the high roofs of Scarnham came into view, "we'll hear what Polke has to tell. Something may have happened since those inquest proceedings this afternoon." But Polke, when they reached his office, had little to tell. Lord Ellersdeane, Betty Fosdyke, and Stephen Hollis were with him, evidently in consultation, and Starmidge at once saw that Betty looked distressed and anxious in no ordinary degree. All turned eagerly on the two detectives, but Starmidge addressed himself straight to Polke with one direct inquiry. "Seen him? Heard of him?" he asked. "Not a word," answered Polke, "nor a sign. If he came down by that train you spoke of, he ought to have been in the town by 4 o'clock at the outside. But he's never been to the bank, and he certainly hadn't arrived at his house 3/4 of an hour ago. And since 10 o'clock this morning t'other's disappeared too." "What, Joseph?" exclaimed Starmidge. "Just so," replied Polke, with the expression of a man who feels that things are getting far too much for individual effort. "He was in the bank at 8 o'clock this morning. One of my men saw him go in by the back way Orchard way, you know. The clerk says he went out that way again at 10, and he's never been seen since." "His house?" said Starmidge. "Have you tried that?" "Know nothing of him there. The old man and old woman say so, at any rate," answered Polke. "He seems to have cleared out. And now here's fresher bother, though I don't know if it's anything to do with this. Mr. Neale's missing. Never been seen since 6 yesterday evening. Miss Fosdyke's anxious." "He was to see me at 9 last night," said Betty. "No one has seen him. His landlady says he never returned home last night. Do you think anything can have happened?" "If anything's happened to Mr. Neale," interrupted Starmidge, "it's all a piece with the rest of it. Now, superintendent," he went on, turning to Polke, "never mind what news I've brought. We've got to find these two Chestermarkes at once. We must go, some of us, to the Warren, some to Cornmarket. See here, Easleby and I will go on to the Cornmarket now. You get some of your men and follow. If we hear nothing there, then the Warren. But quick!" The two detectives hurried out of the police station. Lord Ellersdeane and Betty, after a word or two with Polke, followed. Outside, Starmidge and Easleby paused a moment, consulting. The Earl stepped forward to speak to them. "As regards Mr. Neale," he began, "Miss Fosdyke thinks you ought to know that—" A sudden searching flash, as of lightning, glared across the open space in front, lighting up the tower of the old church, the high roofs of the ancient houses, and the drifting clouds above them. Then a crash as of terrible thunder shook the little town from end to end, and as it died away the street lamps went out, and the tinkle of falling glass sounded on the pavements of the market-place. And in the second of dead silence which followed, a woman's voice, shrill, terrified, shrieking loudly, once, somewhere in the darkness. End of chapter 26. of the Chestermarke Instinct. This LibriVox is in the public domain. Recording by MaryAnn. The Chestermarke Instinct by J.S. Fletcher, Chapter 27, The Old Dovecot. On the previous evening, Wallington Neale, who had spent most of the day with Betty Fosdyke, endeavouring to gain some further light on the disappearance of her uncle, had left her at 8 o'clock in order to keep a business appointment. He was honorary treasurer of the Scarnham Cricket Club. The weekly meeting of the committee of which important institution was due that night at the Hope and Anchor Inn, an old tavern in the Cornmarket. Thither Neale repaired, proposing to rejoin Betty at 9 o'clock. There was little business to be done at the meeting. By 8:45 it was all over, and Neale was going away. As he walked down the long sanded passage which led from the committee room to the front entrance of the inn, old Robert Walford, the landlord, came out of the bow-windowed bar parlour, beckoning him, with a mystery-suggesting air, to follow, and led him into a private room, the door of which he carefully closed. Walford, a shrewd-eyed, astute old fellow, well known in Scarnham for his business abilities and his penetration, chiefly into other people's affairs, looked at Neale with a mingled expression of meaning and inquiry. "Mr. Neale," he whispered, glancing round at the panelling of the old parlour in which they stood, as if he feared that the ancient boards might conceal eavesdroppers, "I wanted a word with you, in private. How's this here affair going? Is aught being done? Is aught being found out? Is that detective chap any good? Him from London, I mean. Is there aught new since this morning?" "Not to my knowledge, Mr. Walford," answered Neale, who knew well that the old innkeeper was hand in glove with the Scarnham police, and invariably kept himself well primed with information about their doings. "I should think you know nearly everything just as much as I do more, perhaps." The landlord poked a stout forefinger into Neale's waistcoat. "Aye," he said, "aye, so I do. As to what you might call surface matter, Mr. Neale. But about the main thing, which, in my opinion, is the whereabouts of John Horbury? Does yon young lady at the Scarnham Arms know aught more about her uncle? Do you? Does anybody? Is there aught behind, like? Aught that hasn't come out on the top?" "I don't know of anything," replied Neale. "I wish I did. Miss Fosdyke's very anxious indeed about her uncle. She'd give anything or do anything to get news of him. It's all rot, you know, to say he's run away. It's my impression he's never gone out of Scarnham or the neighbourhood. But where he is, and whether dead or alive, is beyond my comprehension," he concluded, shaking his head. "If he's alive, why don't we hear something, or find out something?" Walford gave his companion a quick glance out of his shrewd old eyes. "He might be under such circumstances as wouldn't admit of that there, Mr. Neale," he said. "But come, I've got something to tell you, something that I found out not half an hour ago. I was going on to tell Polke about it at once, but I remembered that you were in the house at this cricket club meeting, so I thought you'd do instead. You can tell Polke. I'm in a bit of a hurry myself. You know it's Wymington races tomorrow, and I'm off there tonight, at once, to meet a man that I do a bit of business with in these matters. We make a book together, d'ye see, so I can't stop. But come this way." He led Neale out into the long sanded passage, and down through the rear of the old house, into a big stable yard, enclosed by various shaped buildings, more or less in an almost worn out and dilapidated condition, whose roofs and gables showed picturesquely against the sky, faintly lighted by the waning moon. To one of these, a tower-like erection considerably higher than the rest, the old landlord pointed. "I suppose you know that these back premises of mine look partly over Joseph Chestermarke's garden?" he whispered. "They do, anyway. You can see right over his garden and into the back of his house that is, in bits, for he's a fine lot of tall trees round his lawns. But there's a very fair view of that workshop he's built from the top storey of this old dovecot of mine. We use it as a storehouse. Come up, and mind these here broken steps. There's no rail, you see, and you could easily fall over." He led his companion up a flight of much worn stone stairs, which were built against the wall of the old dovecot, through an open doorway 20 feet above, across a rickety floor, and up another stairway of wood, into a chamber in which was a latticed window, from which most of the glass and the woodwork had disappeared. "Now then," he said, taking Neale to this outpost and pointing downwards, "there you are. You see what I mean?" Neale looked out. Joseph Chestermarke's big garden lay beneath him. As Walford had said, much of it was obscured by trees, but there was a good prospect of one side of the laboratory from where Neale was standing. That side was furnished with a door, and on the level of that door, at the extreme end of the building, was a window fitted with a light-coloured blind. All the other windows, as in the case of the side which Neale had seen previously from the tree on the river bank, were high up in the walls and fitted with red material. And from the curiously shaped smoke-stack in the flat roof, the same differently tinted vapours, which he had noticed on the same occasion, were curling up above the elms and beeches. "Now look here," whispered the landlord. "Do you see that one window with the whitish blind and the light behind it? I came up here, maybe half an hour ago, to see if we were out of something that's kept here, and I chanced to look out on Joseph Chestermarke's garden. Mr. Neale, there's a man in that room with the light-coloured blind. I saw his shadow on the blind, pass and repass, you understand, twice while I looked. And it's not Joseph Chestermarke." "Could you tell, had you any idea, whose shadow it was?" demanded Neale eagerly. "No. He passed in a sort of slanting direction, back and forth, just once," answered Walford. "But his build was, I should say, about the like of John Horbury's. Mr. Neale, Horbury might be locked up there. He's a bad 'un, is Joseph Chestermarke. Oh, he's a rank bad 'un, my lad, though most folk don't know it. You don't know what mayn't be happening, or what mayn't have happened in yon place. But look here, I can't stop. Me and Sam Barraclough's going off to Wilmington now in his motor. He'll be waiting at this minute. You do what I say. Stop here and watch a bit. And if you see aught, go to Polke and insist on the police searching that place. That's my advice." "I shall do that in any case after what you've said," muttered Neale, who was staring at the lighted window. "But I'll watch here a bit. You've said nothing of this to anybody else?" "No," replied the landlord. "As I said, I knew you were in the house. Well, I'm off then. Shan't be back till late tomorrow night, and I hope you'll have some news by then, Mr. Neale." Walford went off across the creaking floor and down the stairs, and Neale leaned out of the dismantled window and stared into the garden beneath. Was it possible, he wondered, that there was anything in the old fellow's suggestion? Possible that the missing bank manager was really concealed in that mysterious laboratory, or workshop, or whatever the place was, into which Joseph Chestermarke never allowed any person to enter? And if he was there at all, was it with his consent, or against his will, or what? Was he being kept a prisoner, or was he hiding? In spite of his own knowledge of Horbury, and of Betty Fosdyke's assertions of her uncle's absolute innocence, Neale had all along been conscious of a vague, uneasy feeling that, after all, there might be something of an unexplained nature in which the bank manager had been, or was, concerned. It might have something to do with the missing jewels. It might be mixed up with Frederick Hollis's death. It might be that Horbury and Joseph Chestermarke were jointly concerned in... But there he was at a loss, not knowing or able to speculate on what they could be concerned in. Strange beyond belief it was, nevertheless, that old Rob Walford should think the shadow he had seen to be the missing man's. Supposing... The door of Joseph Chestermarke's laboratory suddenly opened, letting out a glare of light across the lawn in front, and Joseph came out, carrying a sort of sieve-like arrangement full of glowing ashes. He went away to some distant part of the garden with his burden, came back, disappeared, reappeared with more ashes, went again down to the garden, and each time he left the door wide open. A sudden notion, which he neglected to think over, flashed into Neale's mind. He left the upper chamber of the old dovecot, made his way down the stairs to the yard beneath, turned the corner of the buildings, and by the aid of some loose timber which lay piled against it, climbed to the top of Joseph Chestermarke's wall. A moment of hesitation, and then he quietly dropped to the other side, noiselessly, on the soft mould of the border. From behind a screen of laurel bushes he looked out on the laboratory at close quarters. Joseph was still coming and going with his sieve. Now that Neale saw him at a few yards' distance, he saw that the junior partner and amateur experimenter was evidently cleaning out his furnace. The place into which he threw the ashes was at the far end of the garden. At least 3 minutes was occupied in each journey, And, yielding to sudden impulse, when Joseph made his next excursion and had his back fairly turned, Neale crossed the lawn in half a dozen agile and stealthy strides, and within a few seconds had slipped within the door and behind it. A moment later, and he knew he was trapped. Joseph came back and did not enter. Neale heard him fling the sieve on the gravel. Then the door was pulled to with a metallic bang from without, and the same action which closed it also cut off the electric light. End of chapter 27. Of the Chestermarke Instinct. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by MaryAnn. The Chestermarke Instinct by J.S. Fletcher. Chapter 28. Soundproof. It needed no more than a moment's reflection to prove to Neale that he had made a serious mistake in obeying that first impulse. Joseph Chestermarke had gone away, probably for the night, and there had been something in the metallic clang of that closing door, something in the sure and certain fashion in which it had closed into its frame, something in the utter silence which had followed the sudden extinction of the light, which made the captive feel that he might have beat upon door or wall as hard and as long as he pleased without attracting any attention. The place into which he had come of his own free will was no ordinary place. Already he felt that he was in a trap out of which it was not going to be easy to escape. He stood for a moment, heart thumping and pulses throbbing, to listen and to look. But he saw nothing beyond the faint indication of the waning moonlight outside the red-curtained circular windows high above him, and a fainter speck of glowing cinder left behind in the recently emptied furnace. He heard nothing either, save a very faint crackling of the expiring ashes in the furnace. Presently even that minute sound died down. The one speck of light went out, and the silence and gloom were intense. Neale now knew that unless Joseph Chestermarke came back to his workshop he was doomed to spend the night in it, and possibly part of the next day. He felt sure that it was impossible to obtain release otherwise than by Joseph's coming. He could do nothing, in all probability, to release himself. No one in the town would have the remotest idea that he was fastened up within those walls. The only man to whom such an idea could come on hearing that he, Neale, was missing, was old Rob Walford, and Walford, by that time, would be well on his way to Wymington, 30 miles off, and as he was to be there all night and all the next day, he would hear nothing until his return to Scarnham, 24 hours hence. No, he was caught. Joseph Chestermarke had had no idea of catching him, but he had caught him all the same. And now that he was safely caught, Neale began to wonder why he had slipped into that place. He had an elementary idea, of course. He wanted to find out if anybody was concealed in that room which the landlord had pointed to. Certainly he had felt no fear about meeting Joseph Chestermarke. Yet, now that he was there, he did not know what he should have done if Joseph had come in, as he expected he would, nor what he should or could do now that he was in complete possession. If he had been able to face Joseph, he would have demanded information, point blank, about the shadow on the blind. He even had some misty notion about enforcing it, if need be, but he was now helpless. He could do no good. He could not tell Polke or anybody else what Walford had reported, and if he was to be left there all night, which seemed likely, he had only got himself into a highly unpleasant situation. He moved at last, feeling about in the darkness. His hands encountered smooth, blank walls on each side of the door. He dared not step forward lest he should run against machinery or meet with some cavity in the flooring. And reflecting that the small, insignificant gleam which it would make could scarcely be noticed from outside, he struck a match, and carefully holding it within the flap of his outstretched jacket, looked around him. A first quick glance gave him a general idea of his surroundings. Immediately in front of him was the furnace. A little to its side was a lathe. On one side of the place a long table stood, covered with a multitude of tools, chemical apparatus, and the like. On the other was a blank wall, and in that blank wall, to which Neale chiefly directed his attention during the few seconds for which the match burned, was a door. The match went out. He dropped it on the floor and moved forward in the darkness to the door which he had just seen. That, of course, must open into the inner room to the outer window of which Walford had drawn his attention. He went on until his outstretched fingers touched the door. Then he cautiously struck another match and looked the door up and down. What he saw added to the mystery of the whole adventure. Neale had seen doors of that sort before, more than once, but they were the doors of very big safes or strong rooms. Before the second match burned through, he knew that this particular door was of some metal, steel most likely, that it was set into a framework of similar metal, and that the room to which it afforded entrance was probably sound-proof. He struck a third match, and a fourth. By their light he saw that there was but one small keyhole to the door, and he judged from that it was fitted with some patent mechanical lock. There was no way by which he could open it, of course, and though he stood for a long time listening with straining ears against it, he could not detect the slightest sound from whatever chamber or recess lay behind it. If there really was a man in there, thought Neale, he must surely feel himself to be in a living tomb, and after a time, taking the risk of being heard from the outside of the laboratory, he beat heavily upon the door with his fist. No response came. The silence all around him was more oppressive, if possible, than before. The expenditure of more matches enabled Neale to examine further into the conditions of what seemed likely to be his own prison for some hours. He was not sorry to see that in one corner stood an old settee, furnished with rugs and cushions. If he was obliged to remain locked up all night, he would, at any rate, be able to get some rest. But beyond this, the furnace, a tall threefold screen, evidently used to assist in the manipulation of draughts, and the lathe, table, and apparatus which he had already seen, there was nothing in the place. There was no way of getting at the windows in the top of the high walls. Even if he could have got at them, they were too small for a man to squeeze through. And he was about to sit down on the settee and wait the probably slow and tedious course of events, when he caught sight of an object at the end of the table which startled him, and made him wonder more than anything he had seen up to that moment. That object was a big loaf of bread. He struck yet another match and looked at it more narrowly. It was one of those large loaves which bakers make for the use of families. Close by it lay a knife. A nearer inspection showed Neale that a slice had recently been cut off from the loaf. He knew that by the fact that the crumb was still soft and fresh on the surface, in spite of the great heat of the place. It was scarcely likely that Joseph Chestermarke would eat unbuttered bread during his experiments and labours. Why, then, was the loaf there? Could it be that this bread was that the slice which had just been cut was the ration given to somebody behind that door? This idea filled Neale with the first spice of fear which he had felt since entering the laboratory. The idea of a man being fastened up in a sound-proof chamber and fed on dry bread suggested possibilities which he did not and could not contemplate without a certain horror. And if there really was such a prisoner in that room, or cell, or whatever the place was, who could it be but John Horbury? And if it was John Horbury, how, under what circumstances, had he been brought there? Why was he being kept there? Neale sat down at last on the settee, and in the silence and darkness gave himself up to thoughts of a nature which he had never known in his life before. Here, at any rate, was adventure, and of a decidedly unpleasant sort. He was not afraid for himself. He had a revolver in his hip pocket, loaded. He had been carrying it since Tuesday, with some strange notion that it might be wanted. Certainly he might have to go without food for perhaps many hours. But he suddenly remembered that in the pocket of his Norfolk jacket he had a biggish box of first-rate chocolate, which he had bought on his way to the cricket club meeting, with a view of presenting it to Betty later on. He could get through a day on that, he thought, if it were necessary. As for the loaf of bread, something seemed to nauseate him at the mere thought of trying to swallow a mouthful of it. The rest of the evening went. The silence was never broken. Not a sound came from the mysterious chamber behind him. No step sounded on the gravel without. No hand unlocked the door from the garden. Now and then he heard the clock of the parish church strike the hours. At last he slept, at first fitfully, later soundly, and when he awoke it was morning, and the sunlight was pouring in through the red-curtained windows high in the walls of his prison. End of chapter 28. 9 of the Chestermarke Instinct. This LibriVox is in the public domain. Recording by MaryAnn. The Chestermarke Instinct by J.S. Fletcher. Chapter 29. The Sparrows and the Sphere. Neale was instantly awake and on the alert. He sprang to his feet, shivering a little in spite of the rugs which he had wrapped about him before settling down. A slight current of cold air struck him as he rose. Looking in the direction from which it seemed to come, he saw that one of the circular windows in the high wall above him was open, and that a fresh north-east wind was blowing the curtain aside. The laboratory, hot and close enough when he had entered it on the previous evening, was now cool. The morning breeze freshened and sharpened his wits. He pulled out his watch, which he had been careful to wind up before lying down. 7 o'clock. In spite of his imprisonment and his unusual couch, he had slept to his accustomed hour of waking. Knowing that Joseph Chestermarke might walk in upon him at any moment, Neale kept himself on the look-out, in readiness to adopt a determined attitude whenever he was discovered. By that time he had come to the conclusion that whatever force would be necessary or not in any meeting with Joseph, it would be no unwise thing to let that worthy see at once that he had to deal with an armed man. He accordingly saw to it that his revolver, already loaded, was easily get-atable, and the flap of his hip-pocket unbuttoned. Under the circumstances, he was not going to be slow in producing that revolver in suggestive, if not precisely menacing, fashion. This done, he opened his box of chocolate, calculated its resources, and ate a modest quantity. And while he ate, he looked about him. In the morning light, everything in his surroundings showed clearly that his cursory inspection of the night before had been productive of definite conclusions. There was no doubt whatever of the character of the mysterious door set so solidly and closely in its framework in the blank wall. The door of the strong-room at Chestermarke's Bank was not more suggestive of security. He went over to the outer door when he had eaten his chocolate, and examined that at his leisure. That, in lesser degree, was set into the wall as strongly as the inner one. He saw no means of opening it from the inside. It was evidently secured by a patent mechanical lock, of which Joseph Chestermarke presumably carried the one key. He turned from it to look more closely at a shelf of books and papers which projected from the wall above the table. Papers and books were all of a scientific nature, most of them relating to experimental chemistry, some to mechanics. He noticed that there were several books on poisons. His glance fell from those books to the various bottles and phials on the table, fashioned of dark-coloured glass and three-cornered in shape, which he supposed to contain poisonous solutions. So Joseph dabbled in toxicology, did he? Thought Neale. In that case, perhaps there was something in the theory which had been gaining ground during the last 24 hours, that Hollis had been poisoned first, and thrown into the old lead mine later on. And what of the somebody, Horbury or whoever it was, that lay behind the grim-looking door? Neale had never heard a sound during the time which had elapsed before he dropped asleep, never a faintest rustle since he had been awake again. Was it possible that a dead man lay there, murdered? A cheerful chirping and twittering in the space behind him caused him to turn sharply, away from the books and bottles. Then he saw that he was no longer alone. Half a score sparrows, busy, bustling little bodies, had come in by the open window, and were strutting about amongst the grey ashes in front of the furnace. Neale's glance suddenly fell on the loaf of bread, close at hand, on the edge of the table, and of the knife which lay by it. Mechanically, without any other idea than that of feeding the sparrows and diverting himself by watching their antics, he picked up the knife, quietly cut off a half-slice of the loaf, and crumbling it in his fingers, threw the crumbs on the floor. For a minute or two he watched his visitors fighting over this generous dole. Then he turned to the shelf again to take down a book, the title of which had attracted him. Neale was an enthusiastic member of the territorial force, and had already gained his sergeant's stripes in the local battalion. He was accordingly deeply interested in all military matters. This book certainly related to those matters, though in a way with which he was happily as yet unfamiliar, for its title was On the Use of High Explosive in Modern Warfare, and though Neale was no great reader, He was well enough versed in current affairs to know the name of the author, a foreign scientist of world-wide reputation. He opened the book as he stood there, and was soon absorbed in the preface, so absorbed indeed that it was some little time before he became aware that the cheerful twitterings behind him had ceased. It had made a welcome diversion, that innocent chirping of the little brown birds, and when it ceased he missed it. He turned suddenly and dropped the book. 7 or 8 of the sparrows were already lying on the floor, motionless. Some lay on their sides, some on their backs. All looked as if they were already dead. 2 were still on their feet. At any other time Neale would have laughed to see the way in which they staggered about, for all the world as if they were drunk. And as he watched, one collapsed. The other, after an ineffective effort to spread its wings, rolled to one side and dropped helplessly. And Neale made another turn, to stare at the loaf of bread and to wonder what devilry lay in it. Poison? Of course it was poison. And what of this man in that jealously guarded room, behind that steel door? Had he also eaten of the loaf? He turned to the sparrows again at last, stood staring at them as if they fascinated him, and eventually went over to the foot of the furnace and picked one up. Then he found, with something of a shock, that the small thing was not dead. The little body was warm with life. He felt the steady, regular beating of the tiny heart. He laid the bird down gently, and picked up its companions one by one, examining each. And each was warm, and the heart of each was beating. The sparrows were not dead, but they were drugged, and they were very fast asleep. Neale now began to develop theories. If a mere tiny crumb of that loaf could put a sparrow, a remarkably vigorous and physically strong little bird, to sleep within a minute or two, what effect would, say, a good thick slice of it produce upon a human being? Anyway, the probability was that the captive in that room was lying in a heavily drugged condition, and that was the reason of his silence. He would wake, and surely some sound, however faint, would come. He himself would wait, listening. The morning wore on. He waited, watched, listened. No one came. Nothing happened. He ate more of his chocolate. He read the book on explosives. It interested him deeply, so deeply that in spite of his anxiety, his hunger, his uncertainty as to what might happen, sooner or later, he became absorbed in it, and once more he was called from its pages by the sparrows. The sparrows were coming to life. After lying stupefied for some 4 or 5 hours, they were showing signs of animation. One by one they were moving, staggering to their feet, beginning to chirp. As he watched them, first one, then the other got the use of its wings, and finally, with one consent, they flew off to the open window to disappear. Thereafter Neale listened more keenly than ever for any sound from that mysterious room. But no sound came. The afternoon passed wearily away. The light began to fail, and at last he had to confess to himself that the waiting, the being always on the alert, the enforced seclusion and detention, the desire for proper food and drink, especially the latter, was becoming too much for him, and that his nerves were beginning to suffer. Was Joseph Chestermarke never coming? Had he gone off somewhere, possibly leaving a dead man behind, whose body was only a few yards away? There was no spark of comfort visible save one. Old Rob Walford would be home late that night from Wymington. Sooner or later he would hear of Neale's disappearance, and he would sharpen his naturally acute wits and come to the right conclusion. Yet, that might be as far off as tomorrow. As the darkness came, Neale, now getting desperate for want of food, was suddenly startled by 2 sounds which, coming abruptly, at almost the same time, made him literally jump. One, the first, was a queer thump, 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 which seemed to be both close at hand and yet 1,000 miles away. The second was Joseph Chestermarke's voice in the garden outside, heard clearly through the open window. He was bidding somebody to tell a cab driver to wait for him at the foot of the bridge. The next minute, Neale heard a key plunged into the outer door. Before it turned, he, following out a scheme which he had decided on during his long watch, had leaped behind the screen that stood near the furnace. Ere the door could open, he was safely hidden, and in that second he heard the thumping repeated, and knew that it came from the inner room. The electric light blazed up as Joseph Chestermarke strode in. He put the door to behind him without quite closing it, and walked into the middle of the laboratory, feeling in his waistcoat pocket for something as he advanced. And Neale, peering at him through the high screen, felt afraid of him for the first time in his life. For the junior partner had shaved off his beard and moustache, and the face which was thus clearly revealed, and on which the bright light shone vividly, was one of such mean and malevolent cruelty that the watcher felt himself turn sick with dread. Joseph went straight to the door in the far wall, unlocked it with a twist of the key which he had brought from his pocket, and walked in. The click of an electric light switch followed, and Neale stared hard and nervously into the hitherto hidden room. But he saw nothing but Joseph Chestermarke, standing, hands planted on his sides, staring at something hidden by the door. Next instant Joseph spoke, menacingly, sneeringly. "So you're round again from one of your long sleeps, are you?" he said. "That's lucky. Now then, have you come to your senses?" Neale thought his heart would burst as he waited for the unseen man's voice. But before he heard any voice he heard something which turned his blood cold with horror. The clanking, plain, unmistakable, of a chain. Whoever was in there was chained like a dog, and following on that metallic sound came a very weary moan. "Come on, now," said Joseph. "None of that. Are you going to sign that paper? Speak now." It seemed to Neale an age before an answer came, but it came at last, and in Horbury's voice. But what a changed voice! Thin, weak, weary. The voice of a man slowly being done to death. "How long are you going to keep me here?" it asked. "How long?" "Sign that paper on the table there, and you'll be out of this within 24 hours," replied Joseph. "And, listen you, you'll have good food, and wine, within 10 minutes. Come on, now." Further silence was followed by another moan, and at the sound of that, Neale, whose teeth had been clenched firmly for the last minute or two, slipped his hand round to the pocket in which the revolver lay. "Don't be a damned fool," said Joseph. "Sign and have done with it. There's the pen. Sign. You could have signed any time the last week and been free. Get it done, damn you! I tell you, get it done. It's your last chance. I'm off tonight. If I leave you here, it's in your grave. Nobody'll ever come near this place for weeks. You'll be dead. Starved to death, mind. Long before that. Do you hear me? Come on, now. Sign." Neale half drew the revolver from his pocket. But, as he was about to step from behind the screen, a sudden step sounded on the gravel outside the outer door, and he shrank back, watching. The door opened, was thrown back with some violence, and at the same instant Joseph darted from the inner room, livid with anger, to confront Gabriel Chestermarke. That the younger man had not expected to encounter the elder was instantly evident to Neale. Joseph drew back, step by step, watching his uncle, until his back was against the door through which he had just rushed. His hand went out behind him and pulled the door to, heavily. And as it closed he spoke, and Neale knew that there was fear in his voice. What is it?" he got out. "When did you come in here? Why—" Gabriel Chestermarke had come to a halt in the middle of the floor, and he was standing very still. His face was paler than ever, and his eyes burned in their deep-set sockets like live coals. And suddenly he lifted a forefinger and pointed it straight at his nephew. "Thief!" he said, with a quietness which was startlingly impressive to the excited spectator. "Thief! Thief and liar! And murderer for aught I know! But you are found out! Scoundrel! You stole those securities! You stole those jewels! Don't trifle! Don't attempt to dispute! I know! You got the jewels last Saturday night. You took those securities at the same time. You may have murdered that man Hollis for anything I know to the contrary. Probably you did. But no fencing with me. Now speak. Where are the jewels? Where are those securities? And where is Horbury? Answer! Without lying! You devil! I tell you I know! I know! I have seen Mrs. Carswell!" Gabriel had moved a little as he went on speaking, moved nearer to his nephew, still pointing the incriminating and accusing finger at him. And Joseph had moved too, backward. He was watching his uncle with a queer expression. Neale saw the tip of his tongue emerge from his lips, as if the lips had become dry and he wanted to moisten them. And suddenly his face changed, and Neale, closely watching him, saw his hand go quickly to his breast pocket, and caught the gleam of a revolver. Neale was a cricketer, of reputation and experience. On a felt-covered stand close by him lay a couple of heavy spherical objects fashioned of some shining surfaced material and about the size of a cricket ball, which he had previously noticed and handled in looking around. He snatched one of them up now and flung it hard and straight at Joseph Chestermarke, intending to stun him. But for once in a way he missed his mark. The missile crashed against the wall behind, and then came a great flash, and the roar of all the world going to pieces, and a mighty lifting and upheaving, and he saw and felt and knew no more. End of chapter 29. Of the Chestermarke Instinct. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by MaryAnn. The Chestermarke Instinct by J.S. Fletcher. Chapter 30. Wreckage. The four people standing beneath the portico of the police station remained as if spellbound for a full moment after the sudden flash and the sudden roar. Betty Fosdyke unconsciously clutched at Lord Ellersdeane's arm. Lord Ellersdeane spoke, wonderingly. "Thunder?" he exclaimed. "Strange!" Easleby turned sharply from Starmidge, who, holding by one of the pillars, was staring towards the quarter of the market-place from whence the scream of dire fear had come. "That's no thunder, my lord," he said. "That's an explosion, and a terrible one, too. Are there any gasworks close at hand? It was like—" Polke came rushing out of the lobby behind them, followed by some of his men. At the same instant people began running along the pavements, calling to each other. "Did you hear that?" cried the superintendent excitedly. "An explosion! Which direction?" Starmidge suddenly started, as if from a reverie. He put up his hand and wiped something from his cheek, and held the hand out to a shaft of light which came from the open door behind them. A smear of blood lay across his open palm. "A splinter of falling glass," he said quietly. "Come on, all of you. That was an explosion, and I guess where. Get help, Polke. Come on to the Corn Market. Get the firemen out." He set off running towards the end of the market-place, followed by Easleby, and at a slower pace by Lord Ellersdeane and Betty. Crowds were beginning to run in the same direction. Very soon the two detectives found it difficult to thread a way through them. But within a few minutes they were in the Corn Market, and Starmidge, seizing his companion's arm, dragged him round the corner of Joseph Chestermarke's house to the high garden wall which ran down the slope to the river bank. And as they turned the corner, he pointed. "As I thought!" he muttered. "It's Joseph Chestermarke's workshop. Something's happened. Look there." The wall, a good 10 feet high on that side, was blown to pieces, and lay, a mass of fallen masonry, on the green sward by the roadside. Through the gap thus made, Starmidge plunged into the garden, to be brought up at once by the twisted and interlaced boughs of the trees which had been lopped off as though by some giant axe, and then instantaneously transformed into a cunningly interwoven fence. The air was still thick with fine dust, and the atmosphere was charged with a curious, acid odour, which made eyes and nostrils smart. "No ordinary bust-up, this!" muttered Starmidge, as he and Easleby forced their way through the branches and obstacles to the open lawn. "My God! Look at it! Blown to pieces!" The two men stood for a moment staring at the scene before them, as it was revealed in the faint light of a waning moon. Neither had ever seen the effect of high explosives before, and they remained transfixed with utter astonishment at what they saw. Never, until then, had either believed it possible that such ruin could be wrought by such means. The laboratory was a mass of shapeless wreckage. It seemed as if the roof had been blown into the sky, only to collapse again on the shattered walls. The masonry and woodwork lay all over the lawns and gardens, and amidst the surrounding bushes and trees. In the middle of it yawned a black, deep cavity, from the heart of which curled a wisp of yellowish smoke. Between these ruins and the houses a beech tree of considerable size had been completely uprooted, and had crashed down on the lower windows of the house, part of the wall and roof of which had been wrecked. And on the opposite side of the garden a great gap had been made in the smaller trees and the shrubberies beneath them by the falling in of Rob Walford's old dovecot, the ancient walls and timber roof of which had completely collapsed under the force of the explosion. Over the actual area of the wreckage everything was still as death, save for a faint crackling where some loose wood was just catching fire. Starmidge began to make his way towards it. "The thing is," he said mechanically, the thing is, yes, was there anybody here? Anybody here? We must have lights." And just then, as he came to where the burst of flame was growing bigger, and Polke with a body of firemen and constables came hurrying through the gap in the lower wall, he caught sight of a man's face, turned up to the half-light. Easleby saw it at the same time. Together they went nearer, and Starmidge bent down and found himself looking at Gabriel Chestermarke. "Him!" he whispered. "Then he came here." "He's gone, anyway," muttered Easleby. "Dead as can be." He lifted himself erect and called to Polke, who was making his way towards them. "Bring a lantern," he said. "There's a dead man here." "And keep the crowd out," called Starmidge. "Keep everybody out, while we look round." But at that moment he caught sight of Betty Fosdyke, who with Lord Ellersdeane in close attendance, had made her way into the garden and was clamouring towards him. Starmidge stepped back to her. "Hadn't you better go back?" he urged. "There'll be unpleasant sights. Do go back, amongst the trees, anyway. We've found one dead man already. There'll probably be—" "No," she said firmly. "I won't. Not until I know who's here. Because I'm afraid Mr. Neale may be here. I will stop. I'm not afraid. Whose body have you found?" "Gabriel Chestermarke's," replied Starmidge quietly. "Dead. And whoever's here, Miss Fosdyke, I don't see how he can possibly be alive. Do go back and let us search." But Betty turned away and began to search, climbing from one mass of wreckage to another. Presently an exclamation from her brought the others hurriedly to her side. She pointed between two slabs of stone. "There!" she whispered. "A man's face." Starmidge turned to Lord Ellersdeane. "Get her away aside anywhere for a moment," he muttered. "Let's see what condition he's in, anyway. The other was blown to pieces." Lord Ellersdeane took a firm grip of Betty's arm and turned her round. "That was not Mr. Neale?" he asked. "No," she said faintly. "No." "Then leave them to deal with that, and let us look elsewhere," he said. "Come! After all, you don't know that he would be here." "Where else should he be?" she answered. "I'm sure he's here, somewhere. Help me." She turned away with him in another direction, and the two detectives, with some firemen helping them, got to work on the place where she had pointed out. Presently Polke directed the light of a bull's eye on the dead face beneath them. He broke into an exclamation of amazement. "Who's this?" he demanded. "Look!" One of the firemen bent closer and suddenly glanced up at the superintendent. "It's young Chestermarke, sir," he said. "He must have shaved his beard off, but it's him." They took out what was to be found of Joseph Chestermarke at that particular spot, and went on to search for the rest of him, and for anything else. And eventually they came across Neale, unconscious but alive. His partial protection by the projecting iron walls of the furnace had saved him. He had evidently been carried back with them when the explosion occurred, and wedged between them and the outer wall of the laboratory. He came round to find a doctor administering restoratives to him on one side, and Betty Fosdyke kneeling at the other. And suddenly he remembered, and made a great shift to speak. "All right," he muttered at length. "Bit knocked out, that's all. But Horbury's somewhere. Get at him!" They got at the missing bank manager at last. He, too, had been saved by the thick wall which stood between him and the explosion. He was alive and conscious when they had dug down to him, and his rescuers stared from him to each other when they saw that the broken links of the steel chain were still securely manacled about his waist. Chapter 31. Of the Chestermarke Instinct. This recording is in the public domain. Recording by MaryAnn. The Chestermarke Instinct by J.S. Fletcher. Chapter 31. The Prisoner Speaks. It was not until a week later that Neale, with a bandaged head and one arm in a sling, and Betty Fosdyke, inexpressibly thankful that the recent terrible catastrophe had at any rate brought relief in its train, were allowed to visit Horbury for their first interview of more than a few minutes' duration. Neale had made a quick recovery. Beyond the fracture of a small bone in his arm, some cuts on his head, and a general shock to his system, he was little worse for his experience. But the elder victim had suffered more severely. He had suffered, too, from a week's ill treatment and starvation. Nevertheless, he managed an approving smile when the two young people were brought to his bedside, and he looked at them afterwards in a narrow and scrutinizing fashion, which made Betty redden and grow somewhat conscious. "Not more than 3/4 of an hour at the most, the nurse said," she remarked as they sat down at the bedside. "So if you have anything to say, Uncle John, you must get it said within that." "One can say a lot within 3/4 of an hour, my dear," answered the invalid. "There is something I wanted to say," he went on, glancing at Neale. "I suppose there has been an inquest on the two Chestermarkes?" "Adjourned until you're all right," replied Neale. "You and I, of course, are the two important witnesses. You, principally. You know everything. I only came in at the end." "I suppose there are, and have been, all sorts of rumours," said Horbury. "I don't see how anybody but myself could know all that happened in this horrible business. Hollis, for instance. Have they come up to any conclusion about his death?" "None," replied Neale. "All that's known is that he was found at the bottom of one of the old lead mines. We," he added, nodding at Betty, "were there when he was taken out." Horbury's face clouded. "And I," he said, shaking his head, "was there when but I'll tell you two all about it. I should like to go over it all again, before the inquest is resumed. Not that I've forgotten it," he went on, with a shudder. "I will never do that. It's all like a bad dream. You remember the Saturday night when this all began, Neale? If I had had any idea of what was to happen during the next week That night, between 5:30 and 6 o'clock, I was rung up on the telephone. Greatly to my surprise, I found the caller to be Frederick Hollis, an old schoolmate of mine, whom I had only seen once I'll tell you when later since we were all at school together. Hollis said he had come down specially from London to see me. He was at the Station Hotel, about to have some food, and would like to meet me later. He said he had reasons for not coming to the bank house. He wished to meet me in some quiet place about the town. I told him to walk along the riverside at 7:30, and I would meet him. And after I had dined, I went through my garden and orchard to meet him coming along. I took him over the foot-bridge into the woods. Hollis told me an extraordinary story, yet one which did not surprise me as much as you might think. I knew that he was a solicitor in London. He said that only a few days before this interview a lady friend of his had privately asked his advice. She was a Mrs. Lester, the widow of a man, an old friend of Hollis's, who in his time made a very big fortune. They had an only son, a lad who went into the army, and into a crack cavalry regiment. The father made his son a handsome, but not sufficient allowance. The son, finding it impossible to get it increased, had recourse, after he was of age, to a London moneylender named Godwin Markham, of Conduit Street, from whom, in the course of time, he borrowed some £7,000 or £8,000. Old Lester died. Instead of leaving a handsome fortune to the son, he left every penny he had to his wife. The lad was pressed for repayment. Markham claimed some 15 or 16,000. Young Lester was obliged to tell his mother. She urged him to make terms, for cash. Markham would not abate a penny of his claim, so Mrs. Lester called in Frederick Hollis and asked his advice. At his suggestion, she gave him a cheque for £10,000. He was to see Markham and endeavour to get a settlement for that sum.
The day before he came down to Scarnham, Friday, Hollis did two things. He got young Lester to come up to town and tell him the exact particulars of his financial dealings with Godwin Markham. Primed with these, and knowing that the demand was extortionate, he went, alone, to Markham's office in Conduit Street. Markham was away, but Hollis saw the manager, a man named Stipp. He saw something more, too. On Stipp's mantelpiece he saw a portrait which he recognized immediately as one of Gabriel Chestermarke. Now, you want to know how Hollis knew Gabriel Chestermarke. In this way. I told you just now that Hollis and I had only met once since our school days, some few years ago. I think the year before you came to the bank, Neale. Hollis came up north on a holiday. He was a bit of an archaeologist. He was looking round the old towns, and he took Scarnham in his itinerary. Knowing that an old schoolmate of his was manager at Chestermarke's Bank in Scarnham, he called in to see me. He and I lunched together at the Scarnham Arms. I showed him round the town a bit, after bank hours. And as we were standing in the upper room window of the Arms, Gabriel Chestermarke came out of the bank and stood talking to some person in the market-place for a while. I drew Hollis's attention to him and asked, jocularly, if he had ever seen a more remarkable and striking countenance. He answered that it was one which, once seen, would not be readily forgotten. And he had not forgotten it once he saw the portrait at Markham's office. He knew very well that it was extremely unlikely that so noticeable a man as Gabriel Chestermarke could have a double. Now Hollis was a sharp fellow. He immediately began to suspect things. He talked a while with Stipp and contrived to find out that the portrait over the mantelpiece was that of Godwin Markham. He also found out that Mr. Godwin Markham was rarely to be found at his office, that there was no such thing as daily or even weekly attendance there by him. And after mutual desires that the Lester affair should be satisfactorily settled, but without telling Stipp anything about the £10,000, he left the office with a promise to call a few days later. Next day, certain of what he had discovered, Hollis came down to see me, and told me all that I have just told you. It did not surprise me as much as you would think. I knew that for a great many years Gabriel Chestermarke had spent practically half his time in London. I had always felt sure that he had a finger in some business there, and I naturally concluded that he had some sort of pied-à-terre in London as well. One fact had always struck me as peculiar. He never allowed letters to be sent on to him from Scarnham to London. Anything that required his personal attention had to await his return. So that when I heard all that Hollis had to tell, I was not so greatly astonished. In fact, the one thing that immediately occupied my thoughts was Joseph Chestermarke also concerned in the Godwin Markham money-lending business? He, too, was constantly away at London, or believed to be so. He, too, never had letters sent on to him. Taking everything into consideration, I came to the conclusion that Joseph was in all probability his uncle's partner in the Conduit Street concern, just as he was in the bank at home. Hollis and I walked about the paths in the wood for some time, discussing this affair. I asked at last what he proposed to do. He inquired if I thought the Chestermarkes would be keen about preserving their secret. I replied that in my opinion, seeing that they were highly respectable country town bankers, chiefly doing business with ultra-respectable folk, they would be very sorry indeed to have it come out that they were also money-lenders in London, and evidently very extortionate ones. Hollis then said that that was his own opinion, and it would influence the line he proposed to take. He said that he had a cheque in his pocket, already made out for £10,000, and only requiring filling up the names of the payee and drawer, and that he would like to see Gabriel Chestermarke, tell him what he had discovered, offer him the cheque in full satisfaction of young Lester's liabilities to the Markham concern, and hint plainly that if his offer of it was not accepted, he would take steps which would show that Gabriel Chestermarke and Godwin Markham were one and the same person. Now, I had no objection to this. I had not told you of it, Neale, but I had already determined to resign my position as manager at Chestermarke's. I had grown tired of it. I was going to resign as soon as I returned from my holiday. So I assented to Hollis's proposal and offered to accompany him to the Warren. I don't mind admitting that I was a little, perhaps a good deal, eager to see how Gabriel would behave when he discovered that his double dealing was found out, and known to me. We therefore set off across Ellersdeane Hollow. I have been told while lying here that some of you found the pipe which you, Betty, gave me last Christmas, lying near the old tower. Quite right. I lost it there that night, as I was showing Hollis the view, in the moonlight, from the top of the crags. I meant to pick it up as we returned, but what happened put it completely out of my mind. Hollis and I crossed the moor and the high road, and went into the little lane, or carriage drive, which leads to the Warren. Half way down it we met Joseph Chestermarke. He was coming away from the Warren, from the garden. He, of course, wanted to know if we were going to see his uncle. I told him that my companion, Mr. Frederick Hollis, a London solicitor, had come specially from town to see Mr. Gabriel Chestermarke, and that, being an old friend of mine, he had first come to see me. Joseph therefore said that we were too late to find his uncle at home. Gabriel, he went on, had been suffering terribly from insomnia, and by his doctor's advice he was trying the effect of a long solitary walk every night before going to bed, and he had just started out over the moor at the back of his house. Turning to Hollis, he asked if he could do anything. Was his visit about banking business? Now I determined to settle at once the question as to Joseph's participation in the affairs of the Conduit Street concern. Before Hollis could reply, I spoke. I said, "Mr. Hollis wishes to see your uncle on the affairs of Lieutenant Lester and the Godwin Markham loans." I watched Joseph closely. The moonlight was full on his face. He started, a little, and he gave me a swift, queer look which was gone as quickly as it came. It meant, "So you know." Then he answered in quite an assured, off-hand manner, "Oh, I know all about that, of course. I can deal with it as well as my uncle could. Come back across the moor to my house. We'll have a drink and a cigar, and talk it over with Mr. Hollis." I nudged Hollis's arm, and we turned back with Joseph towards Scarnham, crossing the Hollow in another direction, by a track which leads straight from a point exactly opposite the Warren to the foot of Scarnham Bridge, near the wall of Joseph Chestermarke's house. It is not a very long way, half an hour's sharp walk. We did not begin talking business. As a matter of fact, Hollis began talking about the curious nature of that patch of moorland and about the old lead mines. And when we were nearly half-way, the affair happened which, I suppose, led to all that has happened since. It gave Joseph Chestermarke an opening. Having lost my pipe, and being now going in a different direction from that necessary to recover it, I had nothing to smoke. Joseph Chestermarke offered me a cigar. He opened his case. I was taking a cigar from it when Hollis stepped aside to one of the old shafts which stood close by, and resting his hands on the parapet leaned over the coping, either to look down or to drop something down. Before we had grasped what he was doing, certainly before either of us could cry out and warn him, the parapet completely collapsed before him, and he disappeared into the mine. He was gone in a second, with just one scream, and after that we heard nothing. We hurried to the place and got as near as we dared. Joseph Chestermarke dropped on his hands and knees and peered over and listened. There was not a sound, except the occasional dropping of loosened pebbles, and we both knew that in that drop of 70 or 80 feet Hollis must certainly have met his death. We hastened away to the town to summon assistance. I don't think we'd had any very clear ideas except to tell the police, and to see if we could get one of the fire brigade men to go down. I was in a dreadful state about the affair. I felt as though some blame attached to me. By the time we reached the bridge I felt like fainting, and Joseph suggested that we should go in through his garden door to his workshop. He had some brandy there, he said. It would revive me. He took me in, up the garden, and into the workshop. I dropped down on a couch he had there, feeling very ill. He went to a side table, mixed something which looked and tasted like brandy and soda, brought it to me, and bade me drink it right off. I did so, and within, I should say, a minute, I knew nothing more. The next thing I knew, I awoke in pitch darkness, feeling very ill. It was some little time before I could gather my wits together. Then I remembered what had happened. I felt about. I was lying on what appeared to be a couch or small bed covered with rugs. But there was something strange, apart from the darkness and the silence. Then I discovered that I was chained round my waist, and that the chain had other chains attached to it. I felt along one of them, then along the other. They terminated in rings on a wall. I can't tell you what I felt until daylight came. I knew, however, that I was at Joseph Chestermarke's, perhaps at Gabriel's, mercy. I had discovered their secret. Hollis was out of the way. But what were they going to do with me? Oddly enough, though I had always had a secret dislike of Gabriel, and even some sort of fear of him, believing him to be a cruel and implacable man. It was Joseph that I now feared. It was he who had drugged and trapped me without a doubt. Why? Then I remembered something else. I had told Joseph, but not Gabriel, about my temporary custody of Lady Ellersdeane's jewels, and he knew where they were safely deposited at the bank, in a certain small safe in the strong room, of which he had a duplicate key. I found myself, when the light came, in a small room, or cell, in which was a bed, a table, a chair, a dressing-table, evidently a retreat for Joseph when he was working in his laboratory at night. But I soon saw that it was also a strong room. I could hear nothing. The silence was terrible, and, eventually, so was my hunger. I could rise, I could even pace about a little, but there was no food there, and no water. I don't know how long it was, nor when it was, that Joseph Chestermarke came. But when he came, he brought his true character with him. I could not have believed that any human being could be so callous, so brutal, so coldly indifferent to another's sufferings. I thought as I listened to him of all I had heard about that ancestor of his who had killed a man in cold blood in the old house at the bank, and I knew that Joseph Chestermarke would kill me with no more compunction, and no less, than he would show in crushing a beetle that crossed his path. His cruelty came out in his frankness. He told me plainly that he had me in his power. Nobody knew where I was. Nobody could get to know. His uncle knew nothing of the Hollis affair. No one knew. No one would be told. His uncle, moreover, believed I had run away with the convertible securities and Lady Ellersdeane's jewels. He, Joseph, would take care that he and everybody should continue to think so. And then he told me cynically that he had helped himself to the missing securities and to the jewels as well. The event of Saturday night, he said, had just given him the chance he wanted, and in a few days he would be out of this country and in another, where his great talent as a chemist and an inventor would be valued and put to grand use. But he was not going empty-handed, not he. He was going with as much as ever he could rake together. And it was on that first occasion that he told me what he wanted of me. You know, Neale, that I am trustee for 2 or 3 families in this town. Joseph knew that I held certain securities, deposited in a private safe of mine at the bank, which could be converted into cash in, say, London, at an hour's notice. He had already helped himself to them, and had prepared a document which only needed my signature to enable him to deal with them. That signature would have put nearly $250,000 into his pocket. He used every endeavour to make me sign the paper which he brought. He said that if I would sign, he would leave an ample supply of the best food and drink within my reach, and that I should be released within 36 hours, by which time he would be out of England. When I steadily refused, he had recourse to cruelty. Twice he beat me severely with a dog whip. Another time he assaulted me with hands and feet, like a madman. And then, when he found physical violence was no good, he told me he would slowly starve me to death. But he was doing that all along. The first 3 days I had nothing but a little soup and dry bread. The remaining part of the time, nothing but dry bread. And during the last 2 days, I knew that there was something in that bread which sent me off into long, continued periods of absolute unconsciousness, and I was glad. That's all. You know the rest, better than I do. I don't know yet how that explosion came about. He had been in to me only a few minutes before it happened, badgering me again to sign that authority, and I felt myself weakening. Flesh and blood were alike at the end of their endurance. Then it came. And as I say, that's all. But there's one thing I wanted to ask you. Have those jewels been found? Yes, replied Neale. They were found, all safe, in a suit-case in Joseph's house, along with a lot of other valuables, money, securities, and so on. He was evidently about to be off. In fact, the luggage was all ready, and so was a cab which he'd ordered, and in which he was presumably going to Ellersdeane. And another thing, said Horbury, turning from one to the other. I heard this morning that you'd left the bank, Neale. What are you going to do? What has happened? Betty looked at Neale warningly, stooped over the invalid, kissed him, rose, and took Neale's unwounded arm. No more talk today, Uncle John, she commanded. Wait until tomorrow. Then, if you're good, we shall perhaps tell you what's going to happen to both of us. End of chapter 31. An End of the Chestermarke Instinct by J. S. Fletcher. Recording by MaryAnn Spiegel in Chicago, Illinois, on July 17th, 2010.